The year was 1199, and the man known across Christendom as Richard the Lionheart stood on the edge of an ending he never imagined for himself. He had been the scourge of Saladin, the living embodiment of the Crusader ideal, the warrior king who had carved his name into the stone of history with fire and steel. In the songs of minstrels and the whispered boasts of his soldiers, there was only one fitting end for such a man: death on the field, in the press of battle, sword in hand and victory in sight. But fate had no interest in giving him the death of legend. Instead, Richard would meet his end in a place few had heard of, for a cause unworthy of a king's last campaign. Not in the dust of the Holy Land, nor at the walls of Jerusalem, but in the damp countryside of central France, outside a small and unremarkable stone keep called Châlus-Chabrol. And he would not fall to the lance of a knight or the blade of a champion, but to a weapon the Church had tried to ban for its cruelty, the crossbow, wielded by a boy whose name should have been forgotten by history. It began, as so many tragedies of the medieval world did, with rumors. Word reached Richard of a treasure found in the Limousin region: gold, relics, Roman coins, or perhaps something even older. Accounts differ, as they always do when gold is involved. The truth mattered less than what Richard believed, that here, in a rebellious vassal's domain, lay a hoard that could breathe life into his dwindling fortunes. To a king whose coffers had been bled dry by crusades, ransom, and ceaseless war, it was not simply gold, it was salvation. But there was another reason, one no ledger could show. In the delicate web of feudal power, a king's right to claim such treasure was more than a matter of law, it was a test of dominance. If his vassals could defy him and keep what was his by right, what message would that send to the rest of his realm? To Philip Augustus of France, ever watchful for weakness, it would signal that the Lionheart's grip was slipping. For Richard, the treasure was a matter of survival, not only of his army, but of his authority. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine this as a minor episode in a long and violent reign. Yet in that moment, in the early spring of 1199, this obscure siege carried the weight of an empire. England's continental possessions were already under strain, rebellion simmered in the vassal states, and the treasury was perilously close to empty. The Plantagenet Empire, sprawling and rich on a map, was in truth a fragile thing, held together by the personal will of one man. Richard's decision to go to Châlus-Chabrol himself was, in hindsight, a fatal mixture of pride and necessity. Kings could and often did delegate such punitive actions to trusted captains, but Richard was no distant ruler. Throughout his life, he had led from the front, riding with his men, inspecting the walls, feeling the press of danger firsthand. It was this quality that had won him the loyalty of his soldiers and the awe of his enemies. But it was also the flaw that would undo him. In the mythology of the High Middle Ages, a king's body was a vessel of divine order. The mere sight of him on the battlefield could rally troops or demoralize foes. Yet that same body, exposed to the dirt, disease, and steel of war, was as fragile as any peasant's. Richard knew this. He had been wounded before spears, swords, the punishing son of Outremer, but he had always emerged alive, as though favored by God. That illusion of invincibility would draw him toward the walls of Châlus-Chabrol, where a nameless shot would shatter it forever. The irony is almost too sharp. A king who had crossed continents, fought armies, and endured sieges in the greatest cities of the age would meet his doom not in a grand campaign, but in the muddy courtyard of an unimportant castle. And all because of gold that might never have existed in the first place. The stage was set for one of medieval Europe's most tragic endings, not because of the blood to be shed, but because of everything that would die with him. The banners of the Plantagenets fluttered in the cool March wind as Richard's army encircled the castle. Siege engines were hauled into position, ladders prepared, and the air filled with the rhythmic pounding of carpenters at work. To his men, this was a routine display of power. To Richard, it was something else entirely, a public reaffirmation that he was still the master of his realm, still the Lionheart. But hidden beneath that display was the ticking of a clock that only fate could hear. In the quiet hours before dawn, the mist clinging to the hills around Châlus, no one in the royal camp could have guessed that they were living in the final chapter of the king's life. Yet every choice he made in the days to come, every step toward the wall, every moment without the full weight of armor, every breath would bring him closer to the moment that history would remember, not for the glory he had earned, but for the tragedy he could not escape. By 1199, Richard Plantagenet's name was already etched into the legends of Christendom. Born in 1157 to Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, union that fused vast territories, stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, Richard inherited not just lands, but the fierce, restless spirit of two of the most formidable rulers of the age. Where his father was a shrewd administrator and master of law, Richard was a creature of the battlefield, drawn to war like a falcon to the hunt. From a young age, his life was defined by steel and rebellion. He fought in the brutal family conflicts that tore the Plantagenet dynasty apart, sometimes even against his own father, proving himself as both a tactician and a warrior. By the time the call for the Third Crusade swept across Europe in 1189, Richard was not just ready, he was eager. While other kings hesitated, he emptied his coffers, sold offices, lands, and famously declared that he would sell London itself if a bier could be found. His obsession with the Holy Land was not merely religious fervor. It was a grand stage for a man who lived for the theater of war. In the sweltering heat of Acre, under the blazing Levanten sun, he carved out victories not only with his sword, but with psychological warfare, negotiating with and taunting Saladin in equal measure. His march down the Palestinian coast became the stuff of ballads, and his reputation as the archetypal crusader king, the very image of Christian knighthood, was cemented. Yet the very qualities that made Richard a legend were also the seeds of his undoing. His singular focus on the East came at a heavy price for his western domains. While he battled for Jerusalem, his younger brother John plotted at home, and his continental lands Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine were left vulnerable to the encroaching ambitions of Philip Augustus of France. These were not mere border skirmishes, they were the slow peeling away of an empire. In Richard's absence, his enemies moved swiftly. Normandy's fortresses were besieged, alliances shifted, and the French crown seized lands with opportunistic precision. By the time Richard returned from crusade in 1194, after enduring a humiliating and costly captivity in Austria and Germany, his empire was in disarray. John had nearly usurped the throne. Philip Augustus had tightened his grip on contested territories. The royal treasury was drained, and the nobility, weary from years of levies and war taxes, was growing restless. The king who had once marched on Jerusalem with banners flying now found himself fighting for survival in his own backyard. The last 5 years of his reign became a relentless cycle of sieges and campaigns, each one aimed at clawing back what had been lost. No longer was he the bright figure of chivalric romance. He was a hardened, pragmatic ruler, gambling everything in desperate bids to restore his prestige and the integrity of his dominions. And yet, even in this more desperate phase of his life, the aura of Richard the Lionheart remained potent. He could still inspire loyalty through sheer presence, still terrify his enemies with the knowledge that he would ride into the thick of battle himself. But those who looked closely could see the strain. Campaign after campaign eroded not just his resources, but his margin for error. This was the world into which the rumor of treasure in Limousin arrived. To most kings, it might have been a welcome windfall, a matter to delegate. To Richard, it was a chance, a spark of fortune in a war-weary twilight. He saw in it not just gold, but a lifeline, enough to hire more mercenaries, rebuild fortifications, and perhaps launch one more offensive to put Philip Augustus back on the defensive. Yet there was another truth beneath his urgency. Medieval kingship was not built on bureaucracies or institutions, it was built on personal dominance. A monarch's reputation had to be continually proven, his authority reaffirmed in visible, tangible ways. If a vassal could defy him over treasure, it was not merely theft, it was a challenge to the very order of the realm. And Richard, whatever his other faults, was not a man to let such a challenge go unanswered. That determination, born of pride, necessity, and the harsh logic of feudal power, would carry him to the gates of a castle unworthy of his presence. A place whose name was barely known in England, yet would soon be etched forever into the annals of history. Châlus-Chabrol. There, the Crusader king who had stared down the might of Saladin would gamble his life on a skirmish that should have been beneath him. There, in the shadow of its modest stone walls, the fate of the Plantagenet Empire would take its final turn. When the first whispers of the treasure in Limousin reached Richard in March 1199, they carried more than the scent of wealth, they carried the illusion of rescue. The Plantagenet Empire was stretched thin, its edges fraying under years of conflict. Richard's campaigns had cost dearly, not only in gold but in goodwill. Mercenaries had to be paid, fortifications repaired, and allies bribed to remain loyal. Every coin in the royal treasury had a destination before it ever touched the chest. The story was tantalizing. Aidemar, Viscount of Limoges, a vassal of the crown, was said to have unearthed a remarkable hoard on his lands. Some claimed it was a cache of Roman coins glinting with the faces of long-dead emperors. Others spoke of golden vessels, relics of the early Christian church, perhaps even objects with a saintly provenance that could elevate their possessor's prestige. Whatever the truth, Richard heard only opportunity. In the code of feudal law, any such treasure belonged by right to the overlord, in this case, the king. The Viscount's duty was clear: surrender it in full. But when Aidemar reportedly sent only part of the find, rumors began to swirl that he had kept something of exceptional value back for himself, perhaps a golden table, perhaps a reliquary. Whether this was true or not was almost irrelevant. For Richard, withholding treasure was more than defiance, it was an open declaration that his authority could be tested. The timing could not have been worse for Aidemar. The French king, Philip Augustus, had been probing at Plantagenet borders for years, looking for any weakness to exploit. If word spread that Richard could not enforce his will in the heart of his own domains, it would be an invitation to further incursions. The Lionheart's political position was a fortress under siege, and a single stone out of place could bring the whole structure crashing down. Perhaps in better years, Richard might have sent a trusted captain to chastise his vassal and collect the treasure. But the man who heard this news in 1199 was not the invincible crusader of Acre and Jaffa. He was a ruler pressed to the wall, his resources dwindling, his enemies circling. He could not afford delay or delegation. This was a moment for a demonstration of royal might, swift, personal, and absolute. And so the king himself rode to Châlus-Chabrol. The castle, perched on a rocky outcrop in the Limousin countryside, was hardly a formidable stronghold. A single stone keep, modest curtain walls, and a garrison of perhaps 40 men, some knights, some crossbowmen, the rest local levies. Against Richard's seasoned forces, it should have been a trivial matter. In the royal mind, this siege would be less about war than about theater, a visible and undeniable reminder to every vassal that defiance had consequences. But war, in the medieval world, was never without risk. Even the smallest siege could turn deadly through mischance, treachery, or simple bad luck. And Châlus-Chabrol, insignificant though it seemed, carried its own shadow. Chroniclers later spoke of an ill mood in the royal camp, of omens in the March sky, of the king's unusual irritability. Whether these were superstitions or the sharpening instincts of a man who had lived too long in the company of death, we cannot know. But the sense of foreboding would prove justified. For Richard, the siege was more than a punitive act. It was a statement aimed at three audiences: his vassals, his enemies in France, and his own men. He needed to remind them all that he was still the Lionheart, the king who rode into danger without hesitation, who took the front line as readily as any soldier. It was this impulse born of pride, charisma, and the medieval expectation that a king must lead in person that would soon place him in the path of a nameless crossbow bolt. In the minds of those who watched him, Richard's presence at Châlus was not only right but necessary. They could not know that in answering this small challenge, the king was placing the fate of an empire on a throw of the dice. In the coming days, the treasure's true value, whether vast or paltry, would be measured not in gold coins or holy relics, but in the lives, lands, and legacies it would consume. Châlus-Chabrol was, by almost any measure, unworthy of a king's direct attention. No grand fortress crowned its walls, no sprawling town lay at its base. It was a simple stone keep with a modest curtain wall, the kind of fortification meant to defend a local lord's household and storehouses rather than withstand a royal army. Its defenders, perhaps 40 men in all, were not the elite warriors of Christendom, but a mix of household knights, hired crossbowmen, and farmers pressed into service. Yet in the tense political climate of 1199, symbols mattered as much as stone. To Richard, this small keep represented a test of royal authority. If a rebellious vassal could withhold a king's rightful claim here, what might others attempt in larger, richer territories? The fact that the garrison dared to hold out at all was, in his mind, an insult to be answered decisively. When the king's banners appeared on the hills surrounding Châlus, the siege began in the time-honored manner of medieval warfare. Wooden palisades were thrown up around the royal camp to keep the defenders in and potential relief forces out. Siege engines, mangonels, and trebuchets were rolled into position, their massive counterweights prepared to hurl stone at the walls. Carpenters labored day and night to repair scaling ladders and mantlets, the wheeled shields that would protect attacking soldiers from enemy fire. Richard, ever the hands-on commander, walked among his men, offering encouragement and advice. This was not unusual for him. Throughout his career, he had refused to remain at a safe remove, preferring to see the progress of a siege with his own eyes, to point out weak spots in the enemy's defenses, and to share in the danger of the front lines. It was part of what made his soldiers fiercely loyal. He did not ask them to risk anything he would not risk himself. But in the calculus of medieval kingship, such bravery carried hidden dangers. A king's body was not just flesh and bone, it was the anchor of the realm. His capture or death could unmake years of diplomacy, dissolve alliances, and inspire rebellion in lands far from the battlefield. Every time Richard placed himself in harm's way, he gambled with the stability of his empire. The siege of Châlus progressed quickly at first. The outer defenses began to crumble under the pounding of the siege engines, and supplies inside the keep dwindled. By the fourth day, surrender seemed inevitable. To many in the royal camp, this was shaping up to be a minor episode in the long war against defiance, an object lesson for any lord tempted to test the crown's patience. But as March 25th dawned cool and clear, Richard appeared more restless than usual. Chroniclers would later note that he seemed almost impatient, as if eager to see the matter concluded with his own eyes. By mid-afternoon, he decided to conduct a personal inspection of the castle's eastern wall, where the bombardment had done the most damage. It was a decision both in keeping with his character and fatally careless. That day, Richard donned his mail hauberk and coif, but not the heavy, enclosing helmet that would have offered greater protection. Nor did he carry a shield. Perhaps he believed the defenders too demoralized to pose a threat. Perhaps it was the confidence born of 100 battles survived. Or perhaps it was simply habit, a king accustomed to walking where others feared to tread. The small inspection party rode slowly along the base of the wall, the king pointing out structural weaknesses and suggesting where to position siege engines for the final assault. Above them, the defenders watched from behind the battlements, their movements nervous but not entirely defeated. In their midst was a young man named Pierre Bossel, his crossbow already loaded, his position chosen with care. In that moment, the distance between an empire's stability and its collapse was measured in little more than 50 yards and the pull of a trigger. On the ramparts of Châlus-Chabrol, Pierre Bossel waited. He was no knight of renown, no veteran of foreign campaigns, just a young man pressed into service for his lord, defending a crumbling wall against the might of a king. Chroniclers disagree on his origins. Some say he was a servant's son, others a minor squire, and a few claim he had personal cause to hate Richard, blaming him for the deaths of his father and brothers in earlier campaigns. Whatever the truth, Pierre was an unlikely figure to decide the fate of an empire. He had little in the way of armor. Some accounts claim he wore a mismatched assortment of scavenged pieces, others that he protected himself with nothing more than a large cooking pot strapped over his head. His weapon was a crossbow, a relatively new and feared technology in Western Europe. The Church had gone so far as to condemn it in 1139 at the Second Lateran Council, declaring it too deadly for use against fellow Christians. The ban, like many medieval proclamations, was largely ignored, for the crossbow's power was tempting to set aside. Unlike the longbow, which required years of practice to master, a crossbow could be wielded effectively with minimal training. Its short, heavy bolts could punch through mail at close range, and even a lucky shot from an unskilled hand could kill a seasoned knight. In a siege, where defenders had the advantage of height and cover, the weapon became a terrifying equalizer. Below, Richard rode with a small party of knights and sergeants along the eastern wall, inspecting damage and gesturing toward weak points in the stonework. The spring air was cool, the light clear, and perhaps that clarity emboldened Pierre. He took aim, steadying the weapon against the Merlin before him. The range was about 50 yards, far enough to make the shot challenging, but close enough that a well-placed bolt could still find its mark. Some would later argue it was luck, others that it was skill. Whatever it was, when Pierre pulled the trigger, fate was already in motion. The steel bowstring snapped forward with a sharp twang, and the bolt flew across the gap, spinning slightly, its broad iron head catching the light. It struck Richard in the left shoulder, just below the joint where his mail sleeve met the coif. The impact drove through the chain links, tearing flesh and muscle. Crossbow bolts were designed to lodge deep, and this one buried itself past the barbs, the weight of the iron head making removal dangerous. For a heartbeat, Richard did not fall. Years of battle had taught him to stay in the saddle no matter the shock of pain. He shifted slightly, instinctively moving his arm to assess the damage. Then his knights crowded around him, shouts echoing off the stone walls as soldiers below returned fire at the battlements. Up above, Pierre Bossel realized what he had done. Whether in defiance or in the stunned realization of killing a king, he set down his crossbow, raised his hands, and surrendered on the spot. The siege would continue, but its outcome was now certain, and not for the reasons anyone had expected. Richard, pale but composed, was helped from his horse and escorted back to his tent. Witnesses reported that he even made a wry comment about the crossbowman's aim, a flash of gallows humor from a man who had faced worse wounds and lived. The bolt protruded obscenely from his shoulder, its iron head hidden somewhere inside, lodged against flesh or bone. His personal physician was summoned, a man whose name history does not preserve, and began the grim task of assessing the injury. The wound was serious, but at first glance not necessarily fatal. Richard had survived worse. What no one in that tent realized, however, was that the greatest danger would not come from the crossbow bolt itself, but from what would follow when they tried to remove it. The decision to operate that night, in the flickering light of candles, and without any true understanding of infection, would mark the beginning of the king's slow and agonizing journey toward death. The shot had been fired in an instant, but its consequences would echo for decades across the map of Europe. The work began almost as soon as Richard was laid upon the campaign bed in his tent, the heavy folds of the royal pavilion muffling the sounds of the siege outside. The king's armor was carefully removed, each link of chain mail dragged away from the torn flesh of his shoulder. The wound was ugly, blood seeping around the shaft, the iron head buried deep. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through him, but he clenched his jaw and bore it, as he always had. In the medieval world, surgery was less science than craft, a trade learned by apprentices through battlefield experience rather than formal study. Even the finest physicians of the age had little understanding of infection, bacteria, or antiseptics. The tools at their disposal, iron forceps, knives, probes, were often unwashed and reused. Pain relief was primitive: strong wine, a bitter herbal draught, perhaps a piece of leather to bite down on. Richard's doctor first tried the simplest method, gripping the wooden shaft and pulling steadily. It was the standard approach for arrows, but crossbow bolts were made differently. Their heads were broader, barbed, and meant to resist removal. Worse still, the shaft had been weakened by the impact and the earlier attempts to handle it. The physician pulled harder. In a sickening moment, the shaft snapped in his hands, leaving the iron head and several inches of wood buried inside the king's flesh. The tent fell silent except for Richard's sharp intake of breath. The easy part was over. Now they would have to cut. By candlelight, the physician set to work. His instruments probed into the wound, slicing muscle and sinew in search of the jagged iron. The pain was blinding. Richard, ever the soldier, endured it as long as he could, but the effort drew groans from deep in his chest, curses that made even his hardened knights glance uneasily at one another. He bit down on a strip of leather until his teeth ached, his face pale beneath the fever sheen of sweat. The operation dragged on for hours. Each time the doctor thought he had the bolt, it slipped away. The wound was widened, torn, and contaminated with every probing cut. Blood loss became a serious concern. The royal surgeons could do little more than apply pressure and hope the bleeding slowed. Finally, sometime in the early hours of March 26th, the iron head emerged dirty, jagged, and slick with blood, fragments of mail, and torn cloth clinging to it. The hole it left behind was no clean injury. It gaped wide, ragged at the edges, and already darkening in color. In the dim light, the signs of infection were invisible to their untrained eyes, but its seeds had been sown. In trying to save their king, they had given death a perfect entry point. Richard was bandaged, given wine to dull the pain, and left to rest. But medieval healing relied on more than just physical treatment. It was bound up with theories of the humors, with balancing blood, bile, and phlegm, and with warding off miasmas, the bad air, believed to cause sickness. The doctors would turn to these measures in the days to come, but none could undo the damage already done that night. Within hours, the wound began to fester. The edges swelled, the flesh grew hot, and a dull throbbing pain set in, one that no amount of wine could quiet. By the end of the week, fever would grip the king, and the sweet, corrupt smell of infection would hang over the royal tent. It was not the crossbow bolt that would kill Richard the Lionheart, it was the world he lived in. A world where even kings, for all their crowns and banners, could be brought low by a wound smaller than a man's hand and by the limits of the age's most skilled healers. By the 5th day after the operation, the king's tent had become a place of hushed voices and heavy air. The once bright, commanding presence of Richard Plantagenet was replaced by a figure lying pale and still beneath heavy furs, his skin clammy, his breathing labored. The fever had tightened its grip. The wound no longer bled freely, but it oozed a foul, yellow-green pus, and the swelling now spread from shoulder to chest. The smell was unmistakable, the sickly sweet rot that hardened soldiers recognized as the scent of death. Outside, the siege of Châlus-Chabrol had ended. The defenders had surrendered, knowing that the fall of their walls was inevitable. In the royal camp, there was no celebration, only unease. The men had followed their king across continents, through desert heat and icy rivers, and now they watched him laid low by something too small to see, an enemy immune to swords and shields. Rumors whispered through the ranks. Some said he was cursed, others that God himself had struck him down for his sins in the Holy Land. It was during one of his rare lucid intervals that Richard made a decision that would surprise even his closest companions. He ordered that Pierre Bossel, the young crossbowman who had fired the bolt, be brought before him. The tent filled quickly, knights, clerics, and courtiers crowding in to see what the dying king would do. Bossel was dragged in chains to the foot of the king's bed. 10 days in captivity had left him gaunt, his eyes sunken, his face pale from the damp darkness of his cell. He looked more like a frightened boy than a soldier. Many expected Richard's temper to flare, to see the king's wrath manifest in some terrible sentence. Execution by hanging would have been merciful compared to the punishments medieval rulers could devise, but Richard did not curse him. Instead, with effort and in a voice hoarse from fever, he asked, "What harm did I ever do to you, that you should kill me?" Basil's reply was steady, though his voice was quiet. "You killed my father and my two brothers with your own hand," he said, "and you would have killed me too. Take your revenge in any way you wish. I am ready to endure whatever torment you decree. Knowing have slain the man who brought such evil into the world." The tent was silent. Even those who despised the boy for striking down their king could not deny the weight of his words. And then Richard, to the astonishment of all present, gave his reply. "Young man, I forgive you my death. Live on, and by my bounty, behold the light of day." He ordered Basil unchained, given 100 shillings, and released unharmed. In that moment, Richard, who had built his life on the sword and ruled through fear, chose mercy over vengeance. Some said it was a final act of Christian grace, proof that the king had made his peace with God. Others saw it as a sign of exhaustion, the resignation of a man who knew his end was near and no longer wished to spill more blood. Whatever the reason, the act was unprecedented for him. For years, he had been known for ruthless retribution, burning towns, executing prisoners, crushing rebellion without hesitation. But on his deathbed, he granted life to the man who had taken his own. It was a gesture that would be remembered in chronicles for centuries, even as events would soon twist it into bitter irony. For beyond the tent walls, not all shared the king's will. Mercader, Richard's feared mercenary captain, nursed his own idea of justice. And in the chaos that would follow the king's death, Pierre Basil's reprieve would prove tragically short-lived. The first week of April brought no relief. Each day, the fever climbed higher, and each night the royal tent seemed to sink deeper into shadow. Richard drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling in French or Occitan, other times rousing briefly to issue orders or mutter prayers. His once powerful frame wasted away, and the golden hair that had once caught the sunlight on battlefields was now matted with sweat and grime. The smell of infection filled the air, no matter how much incense was burned. By April 4th, all present understood that the king was dying. His confessor, William Marshall, and his half-brother Geoffrey stood vigil by the bed, reciting prayers for the departing soul. Outside, the army kept an uneasy silence, their siege camp now a place of mourning rather than conquest. The treasure that had lured them here was already being catalogued, its value a pale mockery of the cost it had exacted. On April 6th, Richard's breathing slowed. Those nearest him later swore there was a final moment of clarity, his eyes opening fully, taking in the faces gathered around him. In a whisper barely audible over the murmur of prayers, he asked God for mercy and forgiveness. Then, in the fading light of evening, Richard Plantagenet, King of England, Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, the great Crusader Lionheart, breathed his last. The stillness that followed was suffocating. For a moment, the tent was frozen in disbelief, and then grief broke over it like a wave. Hardened knights wept openly, servants collapsed to their knees. Outside, the news rippled through the camp, and a sense of dread spread with it. The man who had held together a sprawling empire through force of will was gone, and the future was suddenly uncertain. One of Richard's final orders had been that Pierre Basil, the young crossbowman, be spared and rewarded. Mercader, his ruthless mercenary captain, seized the boy, flayed him alive, and hanged his body, a grotesque betrayal of Richard's last wish. In that act, the new reality of Plantagenet power was laid bare. The Lionheart's authority had died with him. The question of succession loomed immediately. Richard had no children, and in his will he had named his brother John as his heir. But John was despised by many of the barons, who favored instead Arthur of Brittany, the teenage son of Richard's late brother Geoffrey. John's reputation for suspicion, cruelty, and incompetence made him the worst possible leader to inherit a fragile empire. Philip Augustus of France wasted no time, even before Richard's body had left Châlus, the French king was already maneuvering to exploit the chaos. Within months, Plantagenet holdings in France would come under renewed attack. Normandy, which had been in English hands for over a century, began to crumble under French pressure. The funeral procession carried Richard's embalmed body to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou to be buried beside his father, Henry II. It was a political as much as a personal choice, a declaration that Richard saw himself not as an English king first, but as a prince of the vast Angevin world his parents had forged. His heart was interred at Rouen Cathedral in Normandy, the symbolic center of his continental power, and his entrails were buried at Châlus, the place of his final defeat. As the cortege wound its way through the countryside, it became clear to those who followed that this was more than a king's burial. It was the funeral of the Plantagenet dream. With Richard gone, the unity of his empire, already strained by distance, war, and politics, would fracture beyond repair, and the decades of war that followed would prove just how much had died in that tent outside Châlus-Chabrol. Richard the Lionheart's death was more than the loss of a monarch, it was the unraveling of an entire political order. His reign had been a personal glue holding together the vast and awkward sprawl of the Plantagenet Empire, stretching from the Scottish borders through England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. It was a realm built less on stable institutions than on his own charisma, military brilliance, and sheer force of personality. With him gone, the web of loyalties binding it together snapped almost immediately. Within months, Philip Augustus moved against John with surgical precision. Normandy, the jewel of the Plantagenet continental holdings, began to fall piece by piece. Fortresses Richard had poured treasure into, like the mighty Chateau Galliard, his rock on the Seine, came under siege. By 1204, Normandy was lost entirely, and with it went Anjou and most of Aquitaine. The Angevin Empire, which had once seemed poised to dominate Western Europe, was reduced to an English island kingdom and a few scattered outposts. The human cost of this collapse was immense. Noble families who had estates on both sides of the Channel were forced to choose allegiance, often abandoning lands they had held for generations. Merchants saw their trade networks crumble as borders shifted and ports changed hands. Soldiers who had pledged their loyalty to the Lionheart found themselves unemployed or pressed into service for lords they had once fought against. For common people, the wars meant heavy taxation, shifting allegiances, and the constant threat of raids. The long-term political consequences were equally profound. The loss of Normandy set England and France on a collision course that would dominate European politics for the next 3 centuries. Without his continental possessions, John turned inward and downward into a spiral of misrule that provoked rebellion at home. His tyranny and failures would force the barons to demand the Magna Carta in 1215, not as a bold charter of liberty, but as a desperate measure to restrain an incompetent king before the realm collapsed completely. Richard's death also marked a turning point in the culture of chivalry and the crusading ideal. He had been the last great figure whose exploits in the Holy Land captured the imagination of Europe on a truly grand scale. Later crusades would be smaller, less successful, and increasingly political rather than religious in purpose. The age of the great warrior kings riding east for God and glory was over. The new age would be defined by more pragmatic rulers, the growing power of bureaucracies, and the slow shift towards centralized states. And then there was the irony, perhaps the cruelest twist of all. The man who had faced down Saladin, survived storms at sea, and escaped from the prisons of the Holy Roman Emperor had not been killed in glorious battle, but by a peasant's crossbow bolt at a minor siege. The wound, in a modern hospital, might have been cleaned and stitched in an afternoon. In 1199, it was a death sentence. Medieval medicine, with its unwashed tools and misunderstood theories, had done more to finish Richard than any weapon could have. Even his last act of mercy toward Pierre Bossel could not survive him. The boy he spared was flayed alive by his mercenaries, a grim reminder that the ideals of honor and chivalry were often crushed under the boots of political reality. Centuries later, the death of Richard the Lionheart still serves as a lesson in the fragility of power. It is a reminder that empires can hinge on the smallest of events, a single moment, a single shot, a single choice to inspect a wall without a helmet. His reign had been one of spectacle and daring, his legend larger than life. But his death stripped that legend bare, revealing the truth beneath, that kings are mortal, and that their works, however great, can vanish as swiftly as the flight of a crossbow bolt. The treasure that drew Richard to Châlus-Chabrol turned out to be modest: some coins, a few gold ornaments, relics of forgotten centuries. It was nowhere near the windfall he had imagined. And yet, in chasing it, he had paid the highest possible price, not only his life, but the stability of the realm he had fought for since boyhood. In the end, what died at Châlus was not just a king, but the Plantagenet dream itself. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of all, that Richard's final battle was not for glory, not for God, and not for the crown, but for a handful of gold that would scatter through history like dust.